The ledger on my desk had been turned a page forward, though I was certain I had left it on yesterday's balance. The neat column of numbers now ended in a bold, unfamiliar hand, the ink still faintly wet. It wasn't the kind of mistake a clerk would make, and my clerks didn't come in on Sundays. Chicago's summer air clung to the room, thick and stale, and somewhere below the streetcars rattled past on Clark Street. I could almost pretend nothing had shifted, that the sound of business carried on as always. But the sight of those altered figures pressed a weight into my chest. They weren't just numbers, they were a quiet announcement that someone was already moving against me. I rose slowly, not because I needed to, but because lately people had been watching for weakness in my movements. At 75, any sign of hesitation was an invitation, and in this city, invitations were rarely polite. The curtains were half drawn, just as I'd left them, yet the smell in the air was wrong. Faint cologne, not mine. The truth arrived without a welcome. My daughter, Clara, had been here. She'd had the key since her mother's funeral, but she had never once stepped into my office without telling me. Not until now. I tried to think of the last proper conversation we'd had, something beyond family dinners and the occasional sharp remark about my hours. That memory came back sour. She had asked if I'd considered letting Daniel, her husband, take a more active role in the business. I'd told her he wasn't ready, which was the gentlest way I could put it. What I didn't say was that Daniel could barely hold his own accounts, let alone mine. That was when I realized the boy's smile never reached his eyes. I shut the ledger, locked it in the cabinet, and sat down again, though I knew I wouldn't be able to focus on any work. A part of me wanted to believe this was nothing, some misunderstanding, but my life had taught me better. Misunderstandings didn't leave fresh ink where there should be dust. By mid-afternoon, the heat in the office had turned oppressive. I opened the window just enough to let in the noise of the street, hoping it might drown out my thoughts. Instead, it brought them into sharper relief. Clara had inherited her mother's patience, but she had Daniel's ambition. Wild, hungry, untested. That combination had its uses, but it also had its dangers. I poured myself a glass of water, my hands steady. I would need to watch them closely now. Not confront, not yet. That would only drive the plot deeper underground. No, I'd learned long ago that it's better to let people think you are unaware. People reveal themselves when they believe you're blind. Still, the change was already there, hanging in the air between us like smoke before a fire. Clara would not have acted alone. Daniel's hand was in this, I was sure of it. And if they had come this far, then they believed the time was right. To move, which meant they thought I was slowing, slipping, losing my grip. I leaned back in my chair, watching the dust drift in the streaks of sunlight cutting across the desk. The city outside roared on, and in here, everything was very still. That stillness was deceptive. It was the kind of quiet that comes before a storm. And that was the moment I knew my own daughter had begun to measure the days until I was gone. The thought didn't fade overnight. It sat at my bedside like an uninvited guest, still there when the first pale light crawled over the windowsill. The city was quieter at that hour, only the distant hum of an early trolley and the slow clop of a milk wagon passing by. My hands found the familiar weight of my watch on the nightstand. It ticked with the same precision it always had, one of the few things left in my life that hadn't begun to falter. I dressed carefully, as if for a meeting I didn't want to admit was already in progress. The suit was charcoal, pressed, a relic from the years when appearance alone could settle doubts. That armor still had value. People underestimated how much a well-chosen jacket could disguise the toll of time. Breakfast was an afterthought. My appetite had left with my certainty the day before. I poured coffee but didn't drink it, the steam rising in thin, hesitant ribbons. Clara's face kept intruding into my thoughts, the smile from our last dinner, polite but rehearsed, and Daniel's hand resting too comfortably on the back of her chair. That touch had been more than affection, it had been a signal. The more I replayed it, the clearer it became that their game was already in motion. If they had been in my office, altering my records, then they had crossed the point of return. Now it was a matter of how deep they intended to cut. By mid-morning, I found myself at the corner of Wabash and Madison, the street alive with the clang of the elevated tracks above and the smell of fresh bread from a nearby bakery. I wasn't there for bread. I had an old friend whose shop front disguised a law office in the back, one of those rooms where the air always carried the faint tang of ink and dust. Elliot Crane had been my attorney for 40 years, through deals both celebrated and discreet. He didn't ask why I came without an appointment. He simply closed the ledger on his desk and looked at me as though he already knew the shape of my trouble. "You've heard something," he said. "I've seen enough," I replied, "and I don't plan to wait for the rest." It was then that I realized the boy's ambition wasn't the only danger. Daniel had patience too. And patience in a man who thinks he's clever is a slow-acting poison. We spoke in low tones, charting out possibilities, each more distasteful than the last. Elliot suggested subtle changes to my holdings, nothing that would draw attention, but enough to make a thief trip over his own expectations. I agreed to. All of it. By the time I left, the streets had grown crowded, the air heavy with the midday heat. I moved slower, not from weakness, but from the need to think 3 steps ahead. Clara would notice soon enough if her plans began to stall, and Daniel would whisper theories in her ear. I needed them guessing, doubting, blaming each other if possible. The idea didn't comfort me. This was still my blood, and some part of me hoped there was another explanation. But even as I thought it, I knew hope was the most dangerous indulgence of all. The afternoon dragged, each hour carrying the weight of a quiet siege. I found myself listening for the sound of the front door, for the voice that might finally tell me how far they were willing to go. And then, as the sun began to dip behind the rooftops, the telephone rang with the kind of news that confirmed my worst suspicion. The voice on the line was measured, almost bored, as if what he was telling me was routine. The bank had received authorization to transfer funds from one of my accounts, an account I had not touched in months, into a separate holding under Daniel's name. They called, the clerk said, simply to confirm I was aware. My knuckles whitened around the receiver. "Cancel it," I said, each word steady but sharp enough to cut. "No further action without my personal signature." The clerk hesitated, but the steel in my tone did its work. Still, the damage wasn't in the money itself. It was in the knowledge that Daniel had both the audacity and the means to attempt it. After hanging up, I remained in the chair, watching the light retreat from the room. The evening settled in with a damp heaviness, and the faint rattle of a window pane reminded me that even the old bones of this building could feel an approaching storm. I thought of Clara then, not with the tenderness a father might feel, but as an opponent studying the next move. If she had consented to Daniel's attempt, she had stepped over a line from which there was no return. If she had not, then the rift between them would begin to widen, and that might be to my advantage. That was when I noticed something unusual. The letter opener on my desk had been shifted, angled just slightly toward the edge. I hadn't touched it in weeks. Its blade caught the last trace of sunlight and gleamed faintly, like an accusation. I rose and walked to the window. Across the street, the silhouettes of office workers moved like shadows in their own cages of glass and wood. Somewhere among them, no doubt, were men who'd done far worse to their own kin in the name of ambition. Chicago had a long memory for such stories, and the streets were littered with the ghosts of those who underestimated their opponents. The more I thought, the clearer it became that this was no longer a question of preserving a business. This was about control. Footnote. By mid-evening, I found myself walking along the river, the lamplight breaking in shards across the water's surface. The city smelled of damp stone and faint coal smoke, and my steps echoed against the warehouse walls. I needed the distance to think. The minor twist in all of this was the timing. Daniel had waited until now, until summer when transactions and audits tended to slow, when my travel into the city was less frequent, to make his move. It was clever in its own crude way, but cleverness without foresight is just recklessness dressed in a better suit. I returned home with a plan forming, each step quiet and deliberate. Elliot would need to set certain papers in motion, ones that would appear innocuous to anyone but us. I would ensure that every path Daniel tried to take would lead him back to my door empty-handed. The house was dark when I entered, save for a single lamp in the front room. On the table lay an envelope, my name written in Clara's hand, the ink pressed deep into the paper. I didn't open it immediately. Instead, I stood there, listening to the faint ticking of the mantel clock, the sound impossibly loud in the stillness. And it was in that stillness that I knew the letter would not contain an apology. The paper felt heavier than it should, as though the words inside had soaked up the weight of every decision I'd ever made. I slid it open with the same care I'd used to disarm a trap, the sound of tearing paper sharp in the quiet. Clara's handwriting filled the page, deliberate and elegant, the way her mother's had been when she was trying to make a point without raising her voice. She wrote of concern, for me, for the future of the family, for the stability of the business. The words were soft, but their arrangement was not. Between the lines lay the true message. It was time for me to step aside. She claimed Daniel had the energy and vision I no longer could, and that resisting this change would invite unnecessary strain. It was not an invitation. It was an ultimatum. I read it twice, folding it back along its original crease, each motion slow enough to keep my temper contained. I had weathered betrayals before, but this one had the particular sting of blood turned cold. By the time I reached the end of the letter, the light had thinned to a pale thread across the floor. I placed it back in the envelope and slid it into the top drawer of my desk. There was no point in confronting her immediately. That would give her the stage, let her script the scene. Instead, I reached for the telephone and dialed Elliot. My voice was level, but the words I spoke began the first major turn in this quiet war. "It's time," I told him. "Begin the transfer." He didn't ask which one. He knew. We had prepared for this moment long before Daniel had married into the family. The mid-hook came without warning. As I set the receiver down, I caught movement outside. A figure, tall, broad-shouldered, lingered just beyond the reach of the street lamp. The cigarette's ember glowed, faded, then glowed again. He was watching the house. I didn't need a closer look to guess whose errand boy he was. Daniel never liked to get his own hands dirty. I stayed by the window until the cigarette winked out and the figure melted into the shadows. My pulse was steady. Fear had no place here. Observation was my weapon now. Later that night, I opened the locked cabinet and removed the old ledger, not the one in current use, but an older book whose pages held agreements written in ink and handshakes. Buried among them was a clause Daniel knew nothing about, a provision that tied my controlling interest to a trust outside the reach of family signatures. If they wanted the business, they would need to challenge the trust itself, and I knew exactly how to make that road a minefield. The major twist was not just that I still held control, but that Clara had underestimated how long I'd been preparing for this betrayal. Years before Daniel even learned my name, I had accounted for the day a friendly face might turn against me. I closed the cabinet and turned off the light. Somewhere in the city, Daniel was likely celebrating an early victory. He had no idea that the field he thought was clear was already sown with traps. And as I stood in the dark, the quiet pressed close around me, I knew the next move had to be mine, and it had to cut deep enough that they would feel it long before they understood it. The morning after, I walked into the office earlier than usual. The street outside was still slick from a light rain, and the air carried the metallic tang of wet rails. My clerks looked surprised to see me, but I didn't acknowledge it. I had work to do, and every moment I gave them was a moment Daniel and Clara could use against me. I unlocked the main safe and removed several files, contracts, title deeds, and the kind of signed agreements that no one ever expects to be read again until it's too late. I laid them out on my desk like chess pieces, each one representing a potential sacrifice or weapon. Some would be moved into the trust Elliot and I had fortified. Others would be sold quietly, diverted into holdings under names they wouldn't recognize. By mid-morning, the rain had stopped, but the tension in the building had not. The mid-hook arrived when I received a brief, unsigned note slid under my office door. It read only, "Lunch at 2, the Drake." The handwriting was Clara's. The Drake Hotel was not just a meeting place, it was a stage. She had chosen it for its elegance, for the privacy of its corner booths, for the way it could make even a threat sound civil. At 2 precisely, I entered the lobby, my cane clicking against the polished floor. I didn't need the cane, but I knew the image it projected. A man aging, perhaps frail, perhaps easier to push aside. Let them think that. Clara was already seated in the far corner, a glass of water before her, the ice melting into silence. She rose to greet me, smiling the way one does when a room is watching. Daniel sat beside her, his suit too new, his posture too rehearsed. "Father," Clara began, "I thought we should speak plainly." "Then speak," I said. She glanced at Daniel, who leaned forward, hands folded. "We can keep this amicable. Transfer operational control to us now, and we ensure the business carries your name. Resist and, well, no one wants a public dispute." There it was, the shape of their play, unvarnished. I let the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. I studied their faces, noting the faintest flicker of anticipation in Daniel's eyes, the tightness in Clara's jaw. "You're certain you want to play it this way?" I asked. "It's the only way forward," Clara said. The major twist came in my reply. "Then you've made a mistake. While you've been drawing up plans, I've been moving the pieces you think you own. By now, half of what you're after is gone, and the rest is locked in a trust you'll never touch without tearing each other apart to get it." Daniel's expression shifted first, the smug certainty draining from his features. Clara's followed, slower but sharper, a realization that she was already behind in a game she thought she was winning. I stood, leaving them in the quiet wreckage of their assumptions. "The thing about ultimatums," I said as I turned to leave, "is that they only work if the other side has something to lose. I don't." Outside, the sky had darkened again, heavy with the promise of another storm. I stepped into it without looking back, feeling the wind gather at my side like an old ally. And as the first drops began to fall, I knew that what I'd set in motion was only the beginning, and that the real fight had yet to show its teeth. The rain didn't let up until well past midnight, drumming against the windows like a warning no one wanted to hear. I sat in my study, the lamp casting a small island of light in the room, watching the waters streak down the glass. My mind wasn't on the storm. It was on Clara and Daniel, and the fact that they now knew I was not a man to corner without consequence. There's a certain expression people wear when their advantage slips. It's not panic, not right away. It's the narrowing of the eyes, the subtle tightening around the mouth. You can almost see them rewinding their last few moves, trying to find the moment they lost control. I imagine them at home, speaking in low voices, Daniel blaming me, Clara wondering if she'd misjudged the man who raised her. The following morning, I took a different route to the office, avoiding the main streets. Call it instinct, or call it the fact that the man I'd seen smoking outside my— Mid-morning, the mid-hook arrived. A message delivered by a boy who couldn't have been more than 12. No envelope this time, just a folded scrap of paper with 2 words. Nice move. No signature, no explanation. I didn't need one. Daniel was letting me know he'd seen the first counter move and that he intended to play on. I slipped the note into my vest pocket and carried on with the day. Outwardly, nothing changed. Inwardly, I began to map the next phase. It wasn't enough to defend my ground. I had to make it costly for them to keep pressing. That afternoon, I paid a visit to a warehouse on the edge of the river. Officially, it was a storage facility for excess inventory. Unofficially, It was where I kept records that didn't belong in any office, the kind that could make or break a man's reputation if they ever found their way into the wrong hands. Daniel didn't know it existed. Clara might have heard whispers, but whispers don't hold weight without proof. Inside, the air was cool and dry, smelling faintly of oil and paper. I pulled a ledger from the shelf, not my own, but one belonging to a business partner of Daniel's, a man whose dealings could not stand the light of day. If I was forced into a corner, this ledger would become the sunlight. The minor twist came when I noticed a fresh set of footprints in the dust near the back wall. They weren't mine, and they hadn't been there on my last visit. Someone had been inside, close enough to touch what I'd hidden. The locks had not been broken, which meant a key existed in hands other than mine. I left without touching anything else. Moving too quickly would only confirm the importance of this place. For now, it had to look like I hadn't noticed. Back in the city, I stopped by Elliot's office. I told him about the footprints, the note, and the meeting at the Drake. He listened without interruption, his eyes narrowing slightly when I mentioned the warehouse. "If they know about it," he said, "they're closer than we thought." "Closer," I agreed, "but not close enough." The day ended with a pale strip of sunlight breaking through the clouds, painting the street in dull gold. I knew the reprieve wouldn't last. The storm, the real one, was still gathering just out of sight, and when it broke, it wouldn't be the weather anyone remembered. By the next morning, the air had that tense metallic weight you feel before lightning strikes. It was a city morning, full of the clang of the elevated tracks and the distant rumble of trucks, yet it all seemed muffled, as though Chicago itself was holding its breath. I kept my movements deliberate, my expression unreadable. The key to surviving a siege, whether in business, in war, or in family, is to let the other side believe the pressure is theirs alone to bear. I arrived at the office to find an unexpected visitor waiting in the hallway. It was Franklin Marsh, a mid-tier supplier who owed me more than one favor. He had the kind of face that always seemed a little too nervous, even in good times. "You got a minute?" he asked, his eyes darting toward my door. Inside, with the door shut, he leaned in. "Word is Daniel's been asking questions. Not just about your holdings, about people who've worked with you a long time. Wants to know where their loyalties are." That was the mid-hook, and it landed with precision. If Daniel was probing the loyalty of my circle, he was looking for cracks to widen. That meant he understood that this wasn't just about signatures and ledgers anymore. It was about influence. I thanked Franklin, knowing that even a nervous man will share news if he thinks it buys him safety. As soon as he left, I began to make a list. Not of assets this time, but of people. Every name I wrote down was someone whose trust I had earned over decades, and every one of them would be hearing from me before Daniel did. By early afternoon, I had arranged 3 quiet meetings. No public places, no paper trail. One was with a foreman who had run my shipping yard since '49, another with a clerk who handled import documentation for certain overseas transactions, the third with an accountant who knew which ledgers were for the tax man and which were for me. The minor twist came during the last of those meetings. The accountant, a man not given to nervous habits, kept tapping his pen against the desk. When I asked what was on his mind, he said, "Your daughter came by last week. Not with Daniel. Alone. Asked for copies of certain quarterly reports. Ones you don't usually share." I asked if he'd given them to her. He hesitated, then nodded once. I didn't show my anger. Instead, I thanked him for his honesty and left him with a clear instruction. If anyone asked for more, no matter who they were, he was to delay, stall, and inform me immediately. The day's work left me feeling both steadied and sharpened. Clara was moving on her own now. Whether that meant she was second-guessing Daniel or preparing her own move, I couldn't yet tell. But either way, it opened an opportunity. Divided opponents rarely last long in a drawn-out fight. Evening came with a heavy sky, the kind that seemed to press down on the rooftops. I stood at my office window looking out over the city lights winking in the gathering dark, and I realized that every step from here would have to be twice as calculated as the last. This wasn't simply about keeping the business. This was about rewriting the rules of who held power in this family. Power is a strange currency. It's never held in equal measure. and it can change hands without a single coin moving. That morning, as I stepped out into the damp air, I could feel it shifting. Not away from me, but in the unpredictable way of a tide when the wind changes. Clara had taken steps without Daniel. That was more than ambition. It was the opening of someone who believed they could command the table on their own. I made my way to the yard on South Canal, where shipments were stacked like fortresses of wood and steel. Men there had worked for me long enough to know when something was brewing. Their handshakes were firmer, their eyes sharper, as if they sensed the same tightening of the air. One of them, Murphy, a man with a scar across his cheek from the docks, told me a detail that caught my attention. "Saw Mrs. Clara here 2 days ago," he said. "Didn't come with a young man. Came with another fellow I didn't know. Spent near an hour in the office upstairs." I asked what they were doing. Murphy shrugged. "Couldn't hear much, but she had a ledger open, not one of ours." That mid-hook lodged itself deep. If she had brought an outsider into my yard and opened a ledger, it meant she was sharing information, perhaps assets, perhaps liabilities, but certainly not for my benefit. By noon, I was at Elliot's office, recounting Murphy's words. He leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. "If she's reaching outside the family, she's either trying to buy insurance or build a new alliance." The minor twist came when Elliot asked a question I hadn't considered. What if Daniel doesn't know? That possibility changed the shape of the board entirely. If Clara was working independently, her goals might diverge from his. That could be used, played against them both, until neither could move without wondering who the real threat was. I left Elliot with instructions to make quiet inquiries about the man seen with her. No obvious trails, no questions that could be traced back to me. In situations like this, knowledge was worth more than any asset I owned. The rest of the day I kept my distance, watching the rhythms of the business as if nothing were amiss. Orders moved, invoices were signed, and, from the outside, everything was as it should be. But beneath it, the current was pulling in new directions. That night I found myself walking the length of Michigan Avenue, the lamps throwing long shadows across the pavement. I thought of Clara as a child, the way she used to sit at her mother's desk, pretending to write important letters, her small hands clumsy but determined. Somewhere along the way, that determination had turned into something harder, sharper. I wondered if I had shaped it, or if it had been there all along, waiting for the moment to surface. Back home, I poured a drink and sat by the window. The street outside was quiet, the kind of quiet that lets you hear your own thoughts too clearly. I knew this couldn't drag on without confrontation, but the question now wasn't whether to confront, it was who to confront first. Confrontation, when done poorly, burns the bridge you might need to cross again. When done well, it forces the other side to step into the open, revealing more than they intended. I knew I choose carefully. But that choice was made for me the following morning, when a telegram arrived at the office. It was short, unsigned, and written in a cipher only 2 people would know: myself and Clara. We'd invented it decades ago, as a game when she was a child, a way to pass secret messages across the dinner table. The words, once decoded, chilled me. Meet alone. Not safe to write more. The mid-hook came from the meeting place she named, the conservatory in Lincoln Park. It was a public space filled with the humid air of tropical plants and the murmur of visitors, yet private enough for a quiet exchange. I arrived early, positioning myself near the orchids, where the air smelled faintly of earth and rain. She appeared 10 minutes late, without Daniel. Her face was pale, eyes darting over my shoulder as if she expected to see someone following her. "Father," she said quietly, "I made a mistake." It wasn't the words that struck me, but the way her hands trembled slightly as she spoke. She told me she had sought out an investor, the man from the shipping yard, to secure her position in the business should I refuse to hand it over. But the man, she now believed, was tied to Daniel in ways she hadn't understood. The major twist landed like a steel trap. She wasn't just competing with Daniel. She'd walked straight into a snare he'd set for her. Daniel had played us both, feeding her just enough ambition to make her reckless, and me just enough warning to make me defensive, while he moved pieces we hadn't seen. I asked her what he wanted from this man. She hesitated, then admitted, "Not just the business, everything with our name on it." We spoke in low voices, the murmur of the conservatory masking our words. She was frightened, but it was the fear of someone who finally sees the scale of the trap around them. I told her plainly that if she wanted out, she'd have to work with me. There was no other path. When we left, we walked in opposite directions to avoid suspicion. The sky outside was low and gray, the lake wind carrying the scent of rain. My steps were slower than usual, not from fatigue, but from the weight of what had shifted. Back at my office, I locked the door and spread out every piece of information I had. Daniel had been patient, methodical, even clever, but cleverness leaves fingerprints. Somewhere in his web, there would be a strand I could pull to bring it down on him. The decision was no longer about protecting myself, or even about holding the business. It was about dismantling the structure he had built, piece by piece, until he was left standing in the open with nothing to shield him. And as I stared at the maps of my own empire, marked now with the faint shadows of his influence, I realized that Daniel had given me something priceless without knowing it. A partner who understood of necessity rather than trust. I knew Clara and I weren't on the same side out of love. We were bound by a shared threat. Still, even the most fragile alliance can be a weapon if wielded correctly. We met again the next evening, this time in the back of a small diner on Halsted where the smell of frying onions clung to the walls. It wasn't a place where Daniel's people would expect to see us. The light over the booth flickered faintly, casting our faces in brief shadows. She came prepared, a small leather notebook in her hand, filled with names and dates. "These are the people Daniel's been meeting," she said. "Some you know, some you'll wish you didn't." I flipped through it slowly, recognizing a few names, minor players in shipping and wholesale, men I'd tolerated but never trusted. Others were less familiar, but the patterns were clear. Daniel was building a network outside my own, one that could undermine my influence without touching the company books. The mid of hook came when Clara pointed to a single name near the bottom. "This one. He's the key. Daniel meets him the most. I think he's the one funding all of it." I looked at her. "Do you have proof?" "Not yet," she admitted, "but I can get it. I just need your help keeping Daniel distracted." This was the turning point of the second major twist. We would stop reacting to Daniel's moves and start dictating the pace. I told her to keep meeting with him as if nothing had changed, to let him believe she was still walking willingly toward his endgame. Meanwhile, I paid a visit to a man named Carson, a discreet investigator who had worked for me on occasions when certain facts needed to surface quietly. He didn't ask why I wanted eyes on Daniel's mysterious associate. He simply nodded and said, 3 days. Those 3 days felt like weeks. I kept the business running as usual, attended the necessary meetings, signed the necessary papers. But underneath it all, the current was shifting. I could feel Daniel growing confident again, mistaking my calm for surrender. On the third evening, Carson came to my office. His report was thin, but the one photograph he slid across my desk was enough to turn the game entirely. The man funding Daniel wasn't an outsider. He was a former partner of mine, someone I'd cut ties with 20 years ago after catching him embezzling from our joint ventures. A man who had sworn with all the bitterness of the betrayed that he would ruin me one day. Clara's reaction when I told her was quiet, but sharp. "So Daniel thinks he's using him, but really he's the one being used." I nodded. "And now we know where the real rot is." The knowledge changed everything. We no longer had to dismantle Daniel piece by piece. We just had to cut the cord between him and his benefactor, and then let the collapse happen on its own. That night, as I left the diner after our final planning meeting, the wind off the lake was colder than it had been in weeks. I buttoned my coat, feeling the weight of what was coming. The next move wouldn't just hurt Daniel, it would make him realize how small a player he truly was. Humiliation is a sharper weapon than loss. Money can be regained, property rebuilt. But once a man's pride is broken in front of those who matter to him, it rarely mends. That was the tool I meant to use now, and I would wield it with precision. The morning after Carson's revelation, I called Clara to my office. She arrived in a dark green coat, hair pinned the way her mother used to wear it, a detail that struck me harder than I expected. We spoke without preamble. "He's meeting the man again this Thursday," I told her. "You'll be there, you'll smile, you'll make him think the ground is solid under his feet." "And while I'm there?" she asked. "You'll give me the window I need." The mid-hook came when she slid a small envelope across my desk. Inside were copies of correspondence between Daniel and his benefactor, the ink still crisp. She'd taken them from Daniel's desk while he was out. My eyes traced the lines, noting the veiled threats, the promises of influence, the casual way Daniel offered pieces of my empire as if they were his to give. "This is enough to make him sweat," I said, "but not enough to end him. We'll need more." We discussed the plan in detail. The meeting would take place in the back room of a gentleman's club on LaSalle, a place where deals were made in whispers and failures were never spoken aloud. Carson would be there, disguised among the staff, and his camera would catch every frame we needed. The minor twist came later that afternoon. Elliot arrived unexpectedly, his hat still wet from the drizzle outside. "You should know," he said. "Your old partner has been asking questions about you, not through Daniel but directly. He's circling for a way to hit you without touching the boy." It was a reminder I didn't need. The man funding this wasn't just an accessory to Daniel's ambition. He had his own score to settle, and if I wasn't careful, my focus on Daniel could leave my flank open to something far older and more dangerous. Still, the plan held. Thursday came with a gray sky and a wind that smelled faintly of the lake. I stayed 2 blocks from the club, waiting for Carson's signal. When it came, a single ring at a payphone I'd been leaning on, I knew the meeting had begun. Inside, Clara played her role flawlessly. Later, she told me how Daniel laughed too loudly, how his benefactor kept one hand on his drink and the other on the boy's shoulder, as though he owned him. Carson's camera caught it all, the handshake sealing their agreement, the documents exchanged, the smug look Daniel wore as he slid them across the table. When I finally held those photographs, I felt the shift, subtle but undeniable. The evidence was enough to destroy their alliance publicly, and in their circles, public destruction was worse than financial ruin. As I studied each image under the lamp's glow, I realized this wasn't just a move against Daniel anymore. It was the beginning of the end for the man who'd been haunting the edges of my life for 20 years. Endings rarely come in a single blow. More often, they arrive in pieces, each one loosening the grip of the old order until it collapses under its own weight. I knew the photographs were enough to wound him, but to end him, I'd have to choose the moment carefully. That morning, I sat alone in the office, the blinds half closed, the photographs spread before me like a hand of cards no one else could see. My fingers lingered on one image in particular. Daniel, smiling wide, leaning toward the man as though they were equals. But in the benefactor's eyes, there was no equality, only ownership. The mid-hook came when Clara arrived unannounced. She looked different, not in dress, but in her carriage. There was a steadiness there now, the kind that comes when fear gives way to resolve. Without a word, she set a folded sheet of paper on my desk. It was a copy of a bank transfer, large enough to turn heads, routed through an account Daniel didn't control. "It's from him to Daniel," she said. "A payment for what they signed that night. It proves Daniel is on his payroll." I studied it for a long moment. This was more than evidence, it was leverage. And leverage, in the right hands, could be turned into a weapon sharp enough to cut them both. The minor twist was in Clara's next words. "I don't want just to help you," she said. "I want in, permanently. No shares through Daniel, no quiet stake. I want my own seat at the table." Her demand wasn't a surprise, but the timing was calculated. She knew I needed her now, and she was making her price clear. Told her I'd consider it, and I meant it. Trust was still a luxury I couldn't afford, but an ally with her access was worth the risk. That afternoon, I met with Elliot to discuss our next move. He advised patience. Let the photographs and the bank transfer find their way into the right whispers. Allow the rot to spread in their alliance. When he starts to doubt his backer, Elliot said, that's when you push. I left his office with the plan settled in my mind. The city outside was restless, the air heavy with the promise of another storm. As I walked, I caught sight of Daniel across the street, stepping into a car I didn't recognize. He didn't see me, but the sight of him, head bent toward someone inside, voice sharp with emphasis, told me that the cracks were already forming. In our world, the smallest rumor could strip a man of allies faster than a signed confession. Back home, I poured a drink and stood by the window, watching the streetlights glow against the wet pavement. I thought of the years this man had lingered on the periphery, always looking for a way to take what I'd built. Now, for the first time, I could feel the ground shifting beneath his feet. Shifts like that don't happen quietly for long. Once the balance tips, the noise follows. Whispers in the right clubs, sidelong glances at the wrong meetings. By the following week, I could see it in the way Daniel carried himself. The swagger was still there, but the edges had dulled. His eyes scanned a room faster, as if trying to catch a knife before it touched his back. I let the days stretch, feeding the silence between us. Silence can be more corrosive than confrontation. It forces the other side to fill it with their own fears. And Daniel had plenty of those. The mid-hook came when Clara walked into my office without knocking, her face tight with urgency. "It's happening," she said. "He met with him last night. Voices were raised. I think they're breaking." I didn't ask how she knew. Some answers were better left unspoken. Instead, I motioned for her to sit and told her we needed to move faster than planned. If their alliance fractured completely, Daniel might try something reckless, and reckless men are unpredictable. Then came the final major twist. Clara leaned forward, her voice dropping. "There's something I didn't tell you. He's been drawing from accounts in my name. If this goes public, it won't just ruin him. It'll drag me under too." It was the kind of confession that changes the terms of a war. She hadn't just been playing a dangerous game alongside him. She'd been tied to his schemes in ways that could destroy her if I failed. For all her ambition, all her maneuvering, she had placed herself on the same plank over the same drop. I studied her, weighing whether this was another tactic or the raw truth. Her hands trembled slightly, not the rehearsed tremor of performance, but the uneven shake of someone who'd just seen how far the fall really was. "We end this together," I said finally, "but when it's done, you take your own seat at the table. No more shadows." She nodded once, the sharpness returning to her eyes. That night, the final play began. Elliot sent word to the benefactor, under the guise of a mutual acquaintance, that Daniel had been holding back assets from him. It was bait, designed to make a man already suspicious turn fully against his pawn. The meeting they arranged was not meant for me to attend, but I was there anyway, in the corner of a smoky back room. hidden behind the hum of a dozen other conversations. I watched as the benefactor's voice rose, as Daniel's protest turned into a frantic defense. As the final thread between the end of it, Daniel left alone, his steps quick, his shoulders hunched. The benefactor stayed behind, his drink untouched, staring into the glass as if he'd seen a ghost. When I stepped back into the cold night, the city felt different, not calmer, not safer, but open in a way it hadn't been for months. There was room now to make the final move. And as I walked home, the street lamps casting long shadows across the wet pavement, I realized that in saving the business, I had also saved Clara, though whether she saw it that way yet was another matter. Clara had been quiet since that night, too quiet. It wasn't the silence of relief, nor was it the guarded distance she'd kept when we first began working together. This was something else, a calculation, perhaps, or the slow drawing of breath before saying something that could change everything. I gave her space for 2 days, keeping to my usual routines, knowing that pressing her too soon might turn her sharp again. In that time, Daniel's absence from the usual circles became conspicuous. No one said where he was, but I didn't need to be told. Men like him, once stripped of their protector, spend their days knocking on doors that used to open freely and now stay firmly shut. The mid-hook came when Clara appeared in my doorway late on the third evening, a storm in her expression. She stepped inside without waiting for an invitation and laid a set of papers on my desk. "This is everything in my name," she said. "Every account, every asset, and every debt I didn't know I had until last night." I scanned the pages. It was worse than I'd imagined. Daniel had been using her credit, her signature, her identity as collateral for ventures so reckless they might as well have been designed to fail. If the wrong creditor decided to collect, Clara wouldn't just lose her stake, she'd be ruined. The minor twist came in her next words. "I want you to clear it. All of it. Then I walk away from you, from the company, from all of this." It was not what I expected. She wasn't asking for her seat at the table anymore. She was demanding a clean slate, even if it meant severing every tie between us. Part of me admired the resolve. Another part saw it for what it was, an escape before the weight of our war crushed her completely. "You think leaving will keep you safe?" I asked. "I think staying will kill me," she said. Her honesty struck deeper than I cared to admit. For all her ambition, she had been dragged into Daniel's schemes, used as both shield and currency. Now, even with him gone, she would never be able to move freely, so long as my world's shadows followed her. I told her I would handle the debts, and I meant it, but I also told her the truth. You walk away now, and you'll spend the rest of your life looking over your shoulder. Better to end it properly. Ending it properly meant one last move. The benefactor still had influence, still had friends in places that could make trouble for both of us. If I wanted Clara truly free, he had to be removed entirely, not just from my path, but from hers. That night, I sent a message through channels we both knew he monitored. It wasn't a threat, just a reminder of the evidence we held and what it would do if it found its way into certain hands. The kind of reminder that makes a man pack his bags before the first knock comes at the door. When the reply came, it was a single line: "You'll never see me again." I believed him. Men like that don't bluff when their survival is at stake. Clara didn't thank me. She didn't have to. The next morning, her office was empty, her desk cleared. The only trace of her, a set of keys left neatly in the center. They sat there on the desk for 3 days before I touched them. Brass worn smooth by years of turning locks, the teeth dulled from use. They looked ordinary, yet holding them felt like holding the last weight of something that had already slipped away. The office felt larger without her, not quieter. There was still the hum of the radiator, the scratch of my pen, the occasional shuffle from the clerks outside, but emptier in a way that wasn't about sound. I had gotten used to her shadow moving just beyond my line of sight. Now there was nothing. The midhook came on the fourth morning when a messenger brought a small envelope with no return name. Inside was a single sheet of paper folded twice with 5 words written in Clara's handwriting. "Don't come looking for me." No signature, no explanation, just that. I set it beside the keys and stared at both until the light through the blinds shifted and the stripes on the desk changed. She hadn't run out of fear, at least not entirely. She had chosen distance, perhaps as a kind of survival, or perhaps as her own final move in a game neither of us had truly won. The business continued. Deals closed, contracts were signed, and Daniel's name was spoken less and less in the city's darker corners. His benefactor had vanished entirely just as promised, leaving behind only a vacuum that others would soon rush to fill. In Chicago, there is never a shortage of men ready to step into another man's ruin. The minor twist came 1 week later when Elliot told me that a certain set of warehouse ledgers, the ones tied to the most sensitive deals, had gone missing, not stolen by force, but signed out by someone with the authority to do it quietly. There were only 3 people who had that authority, and 2 of them were sitting across the table from me. I didn't ask the question aloud. The answer was already there in my mind, as sharp and certain as the edge of a blade. Clara hadn't left, turned against her. On the evening of the 3rd Sunday without her, I walked along the river. The winter air was biting, the water black under the street lamps. I thought of the years spent building, defending, and reclaiming what was mine. I thought of the faces that had come and gone, some buried, some vanished, some leaving behind only a set of keys on a desk. When I returned to the office, the keys were still there. I placed them in the top drawer, locked it, and slid the brass key for that lock into my pocket, not as a keepsake, but as a reminder. In this life, nothing is ever fully yours. Not land, not money, not even blood. You hold it for as long as you can until someone takes it or you let it go. I turned off the light and stepped into the cold night. The street was empty, save for a figure standing half a block away just beyond the glow of the lamplight, watching, waiting. And that was how I knew the game was not over.